You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. Let's get ready to go against the grain. We have another great show for you today. We're going to start it off with some good old-fashioned voter shaming with a side order of drama queen from the 2024 Democratic presidential nominee, Michelle Obama. I think I speak for lefties, the youth, and the African Americans in saying, shut up. Later, we're going to get into a fascinating conversation with researcher and journalist Aline Piva on the strange and potentially disturbing happenings in the Brazilian political sphere. I'm excited to have this conversation. It should be illuminating. You're not going to want to miss it. A little later in the hour, we'll be discussing the tragic and unnecessary live stream car and foot chase that ended in the police shooting and killing of a 21-year-old. It shouldn't need to be said at this point, but just as a public service announcement, whatever your age, whatever your race, they will kill you. Don't do that. In the second hour, we'll be discussing third-party politics and the path of movement building with political activists and former Green Party vice presidential candidate, national organizer of Black Alliance for Peace, Ajamu Baraka. Last but not least, it is Thursday. That means the sexiest name show on the network, Trends with Benefits. We'll be discussing the trend of gentrification in addition to Biden's lackluster unicorn, his Lift Every Voice plan, also known as the Biden Negro plan. That's what I call it. But let's start here. So Netflix is out with a new documentary, Becoming, chronicling Michelle Obama's book tour. Most of this is fluff and it's not something that you're going to all that much care about. But the part that caught my eye was the piece of sublime voter shaming that, like Hillary Clinton, Michelle Obama could not pass up the opportunity to languish in her pain that black folks didn't come out to vote for Hillary Clinton. Her pain. Twice she talks about how, this is the quote, twice she talks about how painful it is that black voters didn't turn out to vote for Hillary Clinton, calling the decision to not vote more painful to her than those who voted for Trump. It takes some energy to go high, and we were exhausted from it, because when you're the first black anything, she said, referencing antidotes from her Becoming book. So the day that I left the White House, and I write about how painful it was that on the inauguration stage, a lot of our folks didn't vote. I was almost like a slap in the face. It was like a slap in the face. I understand that people who voted for Trump, she continued, the people who didn't vote at all, the young people, the women, that's when you think, man, people think this is a game. It wasn't just this election. Every midterm, every time Barack didn't get the Congress he needed, it was because our folks didn't show up. After all that work, they just couldn't be bothered. That is my trauma. That's Michelle Obama's trauma. That's nice to know that's Michelle Obama's trauma. On behalf of all the lefties, younger blacks, trapped Hispanics, kids, the poor, people without a house, people drinking lead water, people that wanted justice for the tanking of the economy by Wall Street, or for that matter, wanted justice for the million of dead Iraqis and the 4,000 dead Americans in the deserts of the Middle East. Add in the desperate many that bought into the Hope and Change advertisement, and frankly, since your husband gave 95% of the income gains to the top 1%, I am also adding in 99% of the population that was stuck fighting over 5% of the income gains. On behalf of all of us, Michelle Obama, shut up. Shut the hell up. I don't want to hear about your trauma. I don't want to hear about your pain. You want to talk about trauma. A man calling himself a socialist ran against Hillary Clinton in the Democratic Party. The masses of youth came out to the tune of 70%. If you were interested in beating Trump, the path was clear. Real, legitimate concessions to bring over that group. You were more concerned with stopping that man, however, than adopting the policies that would have won you the race whole hog. It wouldn't have been close. But you didn't want to do that. You didn't want to give those concessions. That's on you. That pain is on you. I hope you understand this. This is not them. This is on you. This is on your party. It is your party's responsibility to get those people out there to vote. It's just not on them. Your party, they don't owe you squat. Voting is a transactional process. And if after the hope and change stuff, if those people didn't believe that the hope and change rhetoric coincided with actual real material gains, and considering that their health care was going up 50% after you passed Obamacare, maybe they didn't buy into the hope and change stuff, or they didn't necessarily see how that hope and change actually materialized. To make a point, Pew data, almost half of non-voters in 2016 presidential election were non-white. More than half, almost half, even though they compose only 1/4 of the voting population. Even more extreme is the data on class. More than half of non-voters, 56%, are quite poor, making less than $36,000, even though the income gap or income group constitutes just over 1/4 of the voting population. The point is, people who are of African American descent or people of color and people who are poor are more likely to not vote. Now, you would think that these would be your Democratic constituencies, but the catch here is that those people have gotten so disengaged from the political process, from people like your husband, people like Bill Clinton, promising these things and not delivering on those things, giving this hope and change rhetoric, when in reality you govern like a Republican. You had Occupy Wall Street, a mass uprising of human beings that said, we need a different society. This isn't working for us. They crashed the economy and you let them run away with it. None of them got in prison. You bailed them out. And we were screwed over. And with that mass uprising of people, your husband adopted the rhetoric of the 99%. Same husband that gave 95% of the wealth to that 1%. And you were concerned and shocked that those people didn't come out for your husband. The catch here is those people have realized that who they vote for, whether it's Democrat or Republican, at the end of the day doesn't change their material conditions. And because it doesn't change their material conditions, they can't necessarily see the reason for them to go out to vote. Your pathway was clear. That mass uprising told you exactly what you needed to do. The fact that Sanders was elevated to the degree that he was, out of nowhere, he was at 3% when he started that race, told you what you needed to do. Sanders running in this race where he was getting like 70% of the youth vote told you what you needed to do. The majority of the population saying they wanted Medicare for all, expansion of student debt, getting rid of student debt, and elimination, expansion of Social Security. They told you what you needed to do. It was clear as day. You just didn't want to do it. Your issue was the how do you run the race and how do you con those people to vote for you without offering anything real and material gains, while you represent the interests of the 1%. That was your dilemma. Your party made the decision that it was more important to not give political concessions, as opposed to giving those concessions to the left and beating Donald Trump. That is on you. That is not on anybody else. That is not on any lefty. That is not on any Hispanic. That is not on any person that voted. That's not on any Green Party voter. That's not on any of those dejected human beings who rationally pull themselves out of the political process, realizing that that political process is not giving them material gains for the energy that they would expend in that process. And by the way, those people are right. Those people are right. Those are the righteous few. Your salvation, believe it or not, is found doing exactly what those people are doing, with one caveat. State your demands. It is one thing to pull yourself from the political process. That is absolutely correct. But it is also more correct to be able to state the demands for why you're pulling yourself out the political process. A no vote is a vote. It's a vote of no confidence in regards to the political process. You have nearly half of the population that don't vote. And again, the majority of that share would be people who would typically vote for the Democratic Party had that party been responsive to their needs. Don't blame the voters. Blame yourself. Blame your party. Blame the ineffectiveness to which you're dealing with this crisis. Blame the ineffectiveness of the candidate to which you've just put up, a man that is so cognitively challenged and that is literally being accused of a sexual allegation that all of the women had to repudiate the Me Too movement and their previous position to even back the guy. And even he, in the middle of a pandemic, after losing the policy argument across the board, even he said he would veto Medicare for all. I'm trying to put to you that your issue here is your party and what your party is willing to do to ameliorate the concerns of the population. And the fact that it is not willing to do those things, that is not willing to give those concessions, that is not willing to lean to what the majority of the population wants, then you lose. That's on you. That's not on the American public. That is on you. Your pathway is clear as day. You just don't want to open that door. Your wealthy owner class. Tellers are too deep. Bob, voter shaming. I'm not a fan of voter shaming. And especially when it's one of those things where if you wanted those votes, you should have went and got those votes. You can't go after the fact and say, boo-hoo, you didn't vote for my crappy candidate. That doesn't work.
No, I mean, absolutely not on that point. I mean, the Democrats, if you want to look in Michigan and between 2016 and 2020, they lose 100,000 votes and they only lose the election by 11,000. So blame Barack Obama and whatever his administration did to not turn those folks out again. There was more than enough non-voting Democrats to win the race that they did not need to shame libertarians, Green Party, or anybody that stayed home. When there's tens of millions of people that didn't vote and all you needed to find is a few 100,000 across the entire country to be in the White House right now, that's on you. It's not some overarching huge number that people are not without reason withholding from these groups. And the other point I just want to make here in Washington, D.C., Jamal, if you look at the poorest ward in the Democratic primary in 2018 that decides who the mayor of the city is, poorest ward, less than 10% of people turned out. Wow. And that's a Democratic stronghold. This city has been, always will be a Democratic city, at least well into the future. The Democrats in the poorest neighborhood can turn out less than 10%, but somehow all of a sudden in the wealthiest neighborhoods, you turn out 25 to 30%, which is still absolutely dismal, Jamal. 30% turnout is nothing. It's minuscule, but it's 3 times more because those people are actually getting services from the government.
Right there. That's it. Right there. The reason that those people vote in higher numbers is because they are actually getting something back from what they're putting in, meaning their vote is transactional, so they engage. Because the Democratic Party has effectively did this Faustian bargain where they're going to take all of this cash while basically doing this incrementalism. Well, the incrementalism gets such to the point where the people can't tell the difference between one party or the other, and they're like, what's the point? Why am I going to invest my energies in this? And they pull out.
On one note, the other thing that's really disturbing too then is the marketing of the brand and the shaming. And I think that's a different conversation where Michelle Obama's she's not saying this to turn out people that didn't vote. She's doing it for moral superiority to those who did vote for Democrats. So they can say, aren't we better than those people that didn't turn out? You create somewhat of a snidish kind of persona of like, how dare you not do this thing? That's not to motivate. Nobody's going to be motivated by that. Michelle Obama knows nobody's motivated by that to turn out and vote. It's to motivate those who have voted. And that's what's so disgusting by it. And these people are willing to lie here in that ward that I was mentioning, Ward 7 and Wards 8 east of the river here in Washington, D.C. Oftentimes, Jamal, there are conspiracy theories floated amongst people within that community around what's happening to the wealth and the money. And what happens is those Democrats who say, we are on your side, we got you, we're doing everything we can, we are absolutely fighting for you, they then blame and scapegoat other people. And then people don't actually know what's happening with their wealth. They don't know what's happening in their community. They want to trust the Democratic Party, who is supposed to be the party of the people, but then the Democrats lie to them, Jamal, and that's part of it, right? You want people to wake up, they want to state demands, but people are purposely given false information, misaccurate information. They're purposely left out of the political sphere. So how do they even name demands when the 2 major parties in this country are so focused on miseducating and distracting people? How are you supposed to know which way is up when you're just trying to survive?
Well, I would make the case that which way is up is undetached from the political parties. There's no way to get any kind of real view of the world if you're looking through the lens of a party. Parties have specific objectives that they want to accomplish.
I'm saying like from the perspective of a person trying to hang on to a minimum wage job, trying to figure out healthcare, swamped by calls for debt. How are you supposed to figure out which way your demand should go when you're being told all of this misinformation from the people with the bullhorns? I mean, that's the end of the day. Michelle Obama has a Netflix special. She has sold out stadiums with Oprah, and she has a national book. She has the bullhorn. She's the one with authority. And if it's misinformation, how do you counter that to people that are they're not necessarily engaged in politics for many different reasons? Jamal, let's put a pin in it there. There's a lot more to talk about that we can get to later in the show. In the first hour, though, we turn to some international news, looking at the latest from Brazil as President Jair Bolsonaro fights for his political life. That and much more. We have a second hour after that until 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We are live here in Washington, D.C. We're here on Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik. We're back after this.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? Forget the spoon-fed soundbites from the pundits who know so little about so much. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardrooms of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for change speak and are heard loud and clear, 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, the show that goes against the grain. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my disembodied co-host, technologically here, Bob Schlehuber. If you guys are digging what we are putting down, give us a call. Give us a like or share. But you can also give us a call if you have something on your mind or you want to respond to something that we've said. 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. So, I love international politics, and so there is a rather fascinating, I'll even add a bit worrying, story occurring in Brazilian political system. Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro is facing a crisis on two fronts. He has been widely condemned for his disastrous handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, and he is directly responsible for Brazil's high death toll. More interesting to me, though, his justice minister, the famed Sergio Moro, resigned in April, accusing him of interfering with an investigation and firing the federal police chief for personal and political reasons. Al Jazeera is reporting in a scathing 45-minute televised presentation, Moro accused the president of seeking to interfere with an investigation that involved two of Bolsonaro's sons that had requested access to intelligence files. Moro also said that Bolsonaro had presented him to replace the chief of federal police with someone who will be a personal contact of the president. The comments triggered calls to impeach Bolsonaro, a move supported by nearly half of Brazilians, according to the most recent Datafolha survey. The Supreme Court has authorized the investigation into the allegations. Now, just to remind people, Moro is the prosecutor from Operation Car Wash that was used to remove Lula from the election that allowed Bolsonaro to take power in the first place, to which he was handsomely rewarded with the justice minister position. Lula being released when an intercept produced the document showing that the prosecution of Lula was politically motivated to assist that same Bolsonaro. To discuss, we're joined by Aline Piva, researcher and journalist based in Sao Paulo. Aline, how's it going today?
Everything's fine, thanks.
Welcome to the show.
Welcome. Thanks for being with us.
So before I get into the current political climate, could you give us a bit of short context on Brazilian political history? Like, how long has Brazil been a democratic country? And Bolsonaro was under the authoritarian government in power before the country converted into a democracy, correct?
I would argue Brazil is a democracy coup against others in 2016. I think we had an important breach in the democratic rule of law here in Brazil. And that coup that ousted Rousseff kind of led to this whole unraveling of facts here in the country that, for me, I would say that Brazil is not a democracy in the sense that we understand democracy nowadays. One fact that could add to that, other than all the misleading accusations against Rousseff, the way the impeachment process was conducted, but there is also evidence that Jair Bolsonaro, he came into power by undemocratic means. There is proof that was released that he organized this kind of fake news ring, send messages to several people in the country, spreading fake news about the other people who were facing him in the last presidential elections, and that kind of put him in power. More than that, we know that Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, former president of Brazil, he was the leading candidate on that election. And what happened was that Moro, as you said, at that time he was still a judge, he was in charge of the car wash operation, and he illegally took Lula out of the presidential race, and that affected the results as well. So I would argue that Brazil is not a democracy anymore, and for quite some time now.
No, that's fair. That is fair. I agree with you. But I guess I was asking, okay, that's fair. Let's postulate that. But I was also getting to the Brazilian history in regards, because my concern is this. Effectively, Bolsonaro was trying to put people who were basically henchmen in various positions of authority, people who he would be basically close to and aligned to, where he could affect other areas of government through his friendships. That seems like that's a pathway to authoritarianism to me. That's why I was getting to what was Brazil like before, I guess, a democratic revolution in the country itself. Like, when was that? And basically, what year was that? I'm trying to get to Brazilian history. But I also want to kind of juxtapose that with what's taking place now and this kind of power grab within the country itself.
Okay, got it. So you have to remember that Brazil is one of I think Brazil is the only country in the world that has so many coup d'etats. I think it's the leading country in coup d'etats. Brazilian democracy is fairly recent. We had a military dictatorship until 1985, from 1964 to 1985. So it's about 35 years of so-called democracy. What came from that military dictatorship is that, on one hand, the Brazilian constitution that was promulgated in 1988, it's fairly progressive. There is a lot of laws that were put there that we could say were very advanced for the time. For example, the agrarian reform law that was there, never fully implemented, but it's there. It's on the Constitution. But on the other hand, it left open some space for this kind of breach of the democratic rule of law. We have, but more than that, and I think one piece of information that we kind of never put in the analysis of how Bolsonaro got into power, how the car wash operation eroded democracy here, is that in 2005, there was something that here in Brazil was called the Mensalão scandal. That's when the lawfare started to take place here. And then all those breaches in our constitution, they were actually used in this series of attacks to the democracy. The power grab that we are seeing now, it comes from that scandal, that 2005 scandal, and it led to the leak in the country to leave behind part of the coalition that they did coalition government that they did under the Workers' Party and outright support an authoritarian government. As I said, Bolsonaro came into power through undemocratic means. But what is kind of giving way for him to go to this more authoritarian path is, on one hand that he has the support of the military, and on the other hand that he has the support of the elites. We have been listening a lot here in Brazil that it's okay if 3,000 to 5,000 people die as long as Bolsonaro keep implementing this ultra neoliberal agenda that he has been doing. So
well, right there, let me interrupt just one moment. So that's kind of where I want to go to also, because basically there was at one of the I guess it was protests, or maybe it was a governmental support thing, but they were basically chanting for a military junta of sorts. They wanted him to take over. These guys were far-right protesters, far-right supporters, calling for a return of military rule over the country and an end to the quarantine. Bolsonaro replied, "The people are with us, the armed forces are with us, we are the law and order, democracy and freedom is on our side." Following that, the defense ministry put out a statement countering Bolsonaro's claim, basically making the point that the armed forces are on the side of democracy. Are the institutions, the democratic institutions of Brazil, strong enough to basically deal with a situation where, if it does come up, where Moro has the goods on Bolsonaro and they're trying to actually take him out of office because he's committed some crime or something, are the democratic institutions of that country strong enough to do that?
Maybe they are strong enough, but I don't see any kind of political will to act on that direction. Why I say that? If they were so deeply involved in the coup against Dilma Rousseff. Let's say, for example, the Supreme Court, the Brazilian Supreme Court, that would be the instance that could curtail some of those most authoritarian actions from Bolsonaro. Were deeply involved in the lawfare that was used in the car wash operation, but also in the mensalão. For them to act now, they would have to come out and say, okay, sorry, we actually undermined the Brazilian constitution, but this is a bit too far and we have to roll back. They're not going to say that. And the military, that could be the other, maybe force that could stop him by taking out the support that he has right now, they are not going to do so because they have gained a lot of power in this government. Not even during the military dictatorship, we have seen that many high-ranking officials in civil positions. They are occupying ministries and cabinets, very strategic positions in Bolsonaro's cabinet, and they don't want to lose that. But there is maybe a caveat there. What we have been seeing is there is kind of this the military is not completely aligned to Bolsonaro. The high-ranking officials that are part of the government, they support him 100%. But other officials, they are a little worried. We have to remember that Bolsonaro went to rallies, as you said. It's not only his supporters that were asking for the Congress to be closed, for the Institutional Act 5, that was the act that was imposed by the military dictatorship that took out all our civil rights here in Brazil and proposed the Congress. But Bolsonaro himself was there. This other part of the military that are not part of the government, they put so much pressure on their leadership, on the high-ranking officials, that they had to come to the Congress and say no. Bolsonaro is saying that, but we are committed to democracy, we are committed to the constitutional values, and so forth.
Yeah, Eleni, I also wanted to ask you, it's interesting to hear about the internal pressures and power plays that Bolsonaro has made. And obviously, I think what you're saying, in some way, there's some momentum beyond him. He's just kind of the figurehead of this moment, and he'll survive some of a political crisis because somebody else will either fill in, or there's so much repression within the forces of the government. I was curious how much that is then exerted onto the masses of people. It sounds like a terrifying place to be in the opposition. I mean, people think that Bernie Sanders was treated poorly by the DNC. Here you have Bolsonaro and his government throwing Lula in prison. But then you also have people like Marielle Franco, who was murdered for her political stances. And then we've also reported here on Radio Sputnik what's happened to indigenous populations that have tried to speak out there in the country as well. So it seems like anywhere you would try to go, there's great fear of violence to be had against you.
That is true. We have seen a rise in the numbers of cases of attacks against members of the MST, the Brazilian Landless movement, against leadership, of popular and social movements here in the country. But I think that is a trend. That is something that was on the way, but something that is even more worrisome is that Bolsonaro gave basically the go-ahead for to take matters on their own hands. So, like the military dictatorship that they felt they were the ones torturing, bullying, persecuting, what we are seeing here in Brazil is that people are taking matters on their own hands, and we see, for example, landlords imposing their own rules, large landowners killing and hiring mercenaries to persecute those people, take them out, traditional communities, people who fight for agrarian reform. And I think that is, even more worrisome than all that is taking place on a more, let's say, at the state level, because this is changing Brazilian society in a very, very bad way.
Wait, so what is that? I guess, Eleni, I'm curious what that looks like. In 2016, for example, there were 168 murders per day on average in Brazil. It seems incredibly traumatizing for a country to experience that, for families to have to lose loved ones. But I'm guessing there's no follow-up on the vast majority of these killings.
No, not at all. Several people, when you look, for example, at MST, you can see that over 70% of the leadership that were killed throughout the year, over 70% of those cases were never closed. Those people were never persecuted. Sometimes after 30, 40 years, they get some victory, at the judicial system, but that is very, very rare to occur. They don't follow up, and we know that this tends to get worse as the social gap here in Brazil gets larger and larger, right?
So I have a question for you. From the standpoint, Lula, thankfully, former president of the Workers' Party, former president of the country, but representing the Workers' Party, Lula da Silva, finally released. And again, it became clear that this was somewhat of a fraudulent takedown. It was a coup for all intents and purposes. What's going on from the standpoint of the left? I mean, we're hearing a lot about Moro. We're hearing Moro potentially running for office, I think, in 2024. But what is Lula da Silva doing at this point? And what is the left doing at this point in order to contest either Bolsonaro or, for that matter, even a run by Moro himself?
There are several fronts that are being, taken up by the left. One is Lula, and Lula himself, not the party, but Lula has been, following this very interesting new approach good things. So one thing that he's doing is kind of doing auto-criticism of what was his government and what he should have done and what he shouldn't have done. And one thing that he is raising in several occasions now is that he says, I think I was too good to them. Them meaning the elites of the country, the political opposition, and saying, look, they led the way to fascism in this country. And I was convenient with them. It was convenient for me to be in bed with them, but not anymore. And this is not being, let's say, radical. It's just being aware of the consequences that led to this, and some of those were my actions. So he's kind of creating this narrative where I understand what I did wrong, but I do understand, naming names. It's really important.
Just to interrupt, I love that. It's pragmatic. It's not radical at all. It's pragmatic. It's him looking at what happened and having an autopsy and saying, you know what? I was willing to offer a certain olive leaf to them when they were trying to eat me. Like they were trying to eat my arm off, and I'm offering an olive leaf. And he comes to the conclusion, which is rational, yeah, I can't do that anymore. Like, this has to be a certain degree of smash mouth politics where the goal has to be to accomplish my objectives, and I can't necessarily take for granted that they're going to work with me on this. I love that. I love that. So that's basically that's his perspective from here on out. Is the Workers' Party going to run with him with that particular perspective, meaning are they there with him after everything that took place in regard to this coup?
Exactly, because the Workers' Party, during the Workers' Party government, the elites never gained so much money in the history of this country. And now he's, kind of, look, everything that you have is mine. It's because of me, and let's see how you do from that. But there is a problem there, because this is Lula's narrative. The party is still not endorsed it, is not doing that. They are still on that line that let's try to work through institutional means, and that's what leftist parties are doing here in Brazil. They are putting forward calls for impeachment. They are trying to go through regular means. So that might be, a problem for Lula if Lula is the candidate, which I don't think so, because he's still under trial through that federal judicial process against him. And the other thing that we see here now, and I think that's the third trend that we have to kind of, acknowledge, is how social movements are dealing with this government, but more than that, how the coronavirus crisis is helping movements to put forward, to kind of organize the opposition, to Bolsonaro, because Bolsonaro has left people to die, if not starve, dying from coronavirus. So what social movements are doing is kind of, organizing the community, how we can act, organize how distribution of food. It's not like Venezuela, but it's something. And it's having an effect of people understand, okay, so the government is not doing this for me. Why it's not doing this for me right now? So it's never crisis. There is a possibility of something good come out, and I think that's one of them. How it's strengthening popular movements in Brazil.
Yeah, Aline Piva, thank you for joining us. I do just want to ask one more question, if I can steal one last minute from you. I'm curious about, as you mentioned, Venezuela. What are the regional implications currently that are impacting Brazil, and what is Brazil looking to do to have a voice throughout Latin America?
Brazil is completely aligned with the United States. So Brazil has turned its back again to Latin America. It's very worrisome that Brazil, for the first time in its democratic history, we expelled all the Venezuelan diplomats from Brazil, and took all the Brazilian diplomats from Venezuela. That amounts to kind of declaration of war, and it concerns me a lot because we know that Bolsonaro would do whatever Trump tells him to do.
Yeah, quite scary stuff there when it's you and Donald Trump are going to battle. We'll see if Bolsonaro is impacted like Donald Trump is seemingly starting to be impacted by their poor response to the coronavirus. Well, with that, we need to put a pin in it. That was Lini Piva, a researcher and journalist based in Sao Paulo. Lini, where can people find more of you and your work online?
I have some articles published in English at coha.org, the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. I also have my webpage on YouTube. If you search for Lini Piva, you can see some of my interviews, and my weekly show is also there.
Fantastic. Lini, thank you again. With that, we turn to a quick break before coming back with the horrific police killing of a 25-year-old man captured on Facebook Live. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik live in D.C. We're back after this.
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Political Misfits?
Political Misfits who?
Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik?
Not ringing a bell, sorry.
News, politics, culture, cutting through the red and blue spin to get to the real story. From noon to 2 p.m. Eastern at 105.5 in Washington, D.C.
Oh, it's Bob and Jamaro. Of course, come on in.
Aren't you glad you didn't say MSNBC?
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory, or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlehuber here with Jamaro Thomas. Give us a call, 202-5211-320. If you have anything to say on any of the topics we've been talking about, Brazil, we're also talking about the police killing of one Sean Reed in Indianapolis, or you can get back in on the conversation that we kicked off today, Michelle Obama doing some voter shaming. Jamar, let me just close our thought there because we did get caught off there with our wonderful guest there talking about Brazil and the shakeups and terrifying shakeups that are happening there, to say the least. But the thing with Michelle Obama, I just have to say, is this whole idea that people are like, well, you got to play the game to get in the game, and that Michelle Obama, being a black woman, was attacked at every which way, and all of the slurs and all of the threats, all of that stuff's horrific. It's absolutely horrible. Let's be honest. Like, being a black woman in America is not this great thing you get to be. All the microaggressions, the just formal aggressions, passive aggression, all the aggressions come at you. So kudos to her for getting to where she was. And I don't want to take that away from her, though.
Absolutely.
But Jamaro, this whole idea of like, you got to get in the game, and then it becomes about playing the game. And then you're kind of like out of the game. And then you kind of say, wait, did you do anything to help anybody along the way? Or you were just trying to play this political game? Like, how long were you going to be on the inside before you were then like, oh yeah, now I'm going to be radical and speak up for people in some true and meaningful way? You were you were like the first lady for 8 years. Why didn't you do something?
Yeah, it's not magic, right? I mean, it's pretty straightforward. If you're trying to unify the party and you see, just, basically looking at it, Sanders is getting 70% of the youth vote. And you say to yourself, wow, how is he getting the youth vote? The man is nearly an octogenarian, and is running around the country. He's not, fancy looking. He's not wearing these major suits. None of that stuff. Just the guy, just doing his thing. How is he that popular? And you look at the older generation, they're getting with the regular Democrats. If you want to unify the party, adopt his policies. It's very simple. Like, there's no magic to it. They're looking for like a cash, a word or some kind of con or some kind of, ad campaign. It's not an ad campaign. You have people who are actually in trauma, who are actually in dire straits, who are in difficulties, who are working from paycheck to paycheck. I grew up with a mom who was one of those people, and they don't want this tokenism stuff. They just want real material benefits from engaging in the political system, and they don't get it from the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I wanted to start singing "Lift Every Voice" and remind you of Joe Biden's title of like, it is a PR campaign. I mean, this is all PR, right? I mean, the fact that you have a Michelle Obama sitting next to events with one George W. Bush, and then at another event sits next to Ellen DeGeneres, and whatever Ellen DeGeneres sits next to George W. Bush. This is one elite class of people who are also protecting their power and their own interest, that they look down on people. I don't think Michelle Obama is spending time with like average everyday people. Neither is Ellen DeGeneres. Sure, on her show she has guests of like the cute little 9-year-old kid from Alabama who was good at singing, but I don't think Ellen DeGeneres is like hanging out with like everyday non-famous, non-extremely wealthy people. And so this notion that we're going to blame voters who are living in poverty or vote shame people for voting a third party as if they like actually study. That's what's always crazy to me. If you're actually like consciously voting for a third party in America and like studying and reading and looking into this stuff, shouldn't we applaud you for actually engaging in a democratic process more than just blindly picking a Democrat or Republican?
Yeah, that's right. And by the way, I still say it's up to Democrats. Like, to try to voter shame is trying to put it on somebody else, like it's their responsibility. This is kind of like oil companies saying, hey, you should recycle, buddy. It's like, well, yeah, but 70% of the damage, you're kind of causing it, and you knew you were causing that damage. Don't put it on me when you're the main one that's causing it. It's kind of like that. That basically, if the Democratic Party honestly believes that Trump is the second coming, if they believe that Trump is going to eat babies, kick puppies, if he's going to basically, be a Goliath, bestriding the earth, destroying property and destroying the world, then it sounds like political concessions is a small price to pay to stop the man who's going to destroy the world.
Yeah,
But,
and isn't this why the inauthenticity of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, at the end of the day, showed to me is when they couldn't just call out the Democratic Party for doing just this. Yeah. And one level, it was really, there was one level of Elizabeth Warren doing it because she was like, Democratic Party, great place, just got here, love it, great designs, love everything the party stands for, nothing wrong here. There's corrupt things out there trying to influence us. Bernie Sanders was a little bit better because he said like the party's corrupt, there's some bad things happening within it, there's billionaires, but then he wasn't willing just to say, and Joe Biden is one of them.
Yeah, he could never tag to him.
That's so inauthentic about this kind of argument. It's like you're doing voter shaming as opposed to simply saying, your party did not actually carry through the policies it said it would. It does not actually care about changing people's material conditions. It only cares about sloganeering, and this party needs to be gutted and then fixed, then say we're going to rebuild it. Why didn't Bernie Sanders just say, I'm going to burn the thing down, but we're going to rebuild it in a way that actually matches what it says to what it does?
I don't know if Sanders ever wanted to really win. That's where I'm at. Because it doesn't make sense otherwise. I can't reconcile. Honestly, I'm just being very honest.
Oh, yeah.
I can't reconcile how he ran the race. Like, look, some of this is about my own bias. I grew up playing chess since I was like 12 years old, and I played tournament chess in adult tournaments going back since I was 13. My understanding and framework of the world revolves around action and consequence, and how those action and consequences get you to larger objectives. When you're in a political space, I just think of it in the same way, with just larger variables that you have to operate. And he ignored most of those variables. Like to run a race like that, where you're just basically saying, I'm going to give speeches. And I'm going to win just by giving speeches. And it's like, yeah, but your opponents are lying. That's okay. I'm going to give speeches. It's like, but they're lying on you. I'm just going to give speeches. It's like, you can't win like that. What are you doing? Yeah. And after a while, you're like, I get so aggravated because I kept saying, what is he doing? I understand some people are like, yeah, rah-rah Sanders. I said, but there's room for improvement because he doesn't have a killer instinct, and that doesn't work. And then all of a sudden, everything goes, on flames, and people are like wringing their hands. And I'm like, but he never ran the race. I mean, and now you're fighting for these token gestures when the actual fight boiled down to whether or not you were going to willing to deal with this issue of class. And deal with this issue of class is filtered through the issue of party. And like you said, he had to tie Joe Biden to all of those corrupt actors in the Democratic Party, as he calls it, but he could never do it. And because he couldn't do it, there was no way for him to ever get over that hump. Like that, it felt like a betrayal, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think on part of it, and I want to pivot into our next story, is that there was something happening that was class related, but also deeply rooted in the streets of the United States. And it comes to police brutality, the criminal injustice system. It was something that a speech tomorrow by a white old man senator, sorry, an old man, older white male from Vermont. There's a better way to articulate his qualifiers there. But a man that wasn't necessarily in the street. A great speech is one thing, and it's extremely powerful. It's another thing to be hand in hand with these communities at very local levels, and that's something our revolution in a matter of 4 years wasn't going to be able to create. I mean, it's decade-long movements to address these type of things. It's not going to just be one simple moment, and that's what we're continuing to see. As much as there was over the last 6-7 years a larger Black Lives Matter movement in this country, we're still seeing police brutality, and we're seeing white supremacists with guns take the quote-unquote law into their own hand. Jamal, we had mentioned yesterday about the police, the killing of Georgia man, a 25-year-old Ahmaud Arbery, yesterday in the video that emerged showing two white vigilantes killing him while he was jogging. Well, today another video has emerged of a high-speed police chase in Indianapolis ending in the killing of a 21-year-old Sean Reed. Let me tell you a little bit about this story, Jamal. I'll get some of your thoughts in response because there's quite a few ways to go with it. The Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department said officers were pursuing Reed because he was driving recklessly. Police began chasing Reed in his car while at the same time Reed began filming live on Facebook, quickly accumulating nearly 4,000 watchers. Reed leads a chase before parking his car. Before he gets out of the car, Reed says, quote, "I'm on 62nd and Michigan. I just parked. I'm gone." He then pleads, "Please come get me," for the maybe fourth or fifth time in the video that he kept on saying, "Please come get me." Reed then exits the car and allegedly runs. A police officer chased him on foot, according to the police, for a short distance, resulting in an exchange of gunfire around 6:15 p.m., according to officers. At least 13 to 14 gunshots were heard on the video. Reed was then pronounced dead on the scene. Soon after, in the hours after the incident, between 100 and 150 protesters came out in support of Sean Reed, chanting "Murder, murder, and no justice, no peace" at police on the scene. Reed's sister spoke after the killing, expressing wonder to why police couldn't have tased him or, quote, beat him up instead of taking his life. She would have taken the beating him up. I mean, what a tragic, horrible statement to have.
Yeah, it is. That's a horrible statement. That
Killed,
is a really horrible
it's
statement.
honest. Beat him up. Don't kill him. Reed's sister said he could be behind bars, but now he'll be in a casket the next time I see him. Let me first say that these killings happen all the time in the United States. In 2019 alone, the U.S. police killed 1,099 people. That's 3 deaths a day. This story gained international audience because Reed was streaming it on Facebook Live, which is a conversation in of itself, but it's not a unique story. That being said, what needs to be highlighted in this situation is that police are not supposed to engage in these high-speed chases. They're incredibly dangerous. You put other drivers and pedestrians in risk, and you put officers in risk for really low gain. What is a deadly high-speed chase worth if you're just to arrest one person and then send that one person to jail for 10 to 20 years, and that's worth putting all those other people at risk? And further, Jamal, what an absurd situation in general for a police officer to put themselves in. Could you imagine driving nearly 90 miles per hour, swerving left, swerving right, and then to jump out of your car and begin running full speed with a gun in hand to murder the person you're chasing? Did that officer even get a water break? But thank you, Hollywood, for glorifying police and high-speed chases because, again, what do we get at the end of the day? A 25-year-old dead male and now either a traumatized police officer or a police officer with a thirst for blood. Jamal, I just don't get the whole idea behind these high-speed chases. I was joking with you offline earlier. It feels like in Bond movies where James Bond chases after one villain and on the way he kills 40 other people, destroys the town square, and does irreparable damage, that these officers are engaged in these high-speed chases. There's pedestrians, there's other vehicles, and then at the end of it, clearly this person was having a mental health breakdown because you can hear him on the video basically saying like, "Oh, I shouldn't be doing this. Somebody come get me. This is where I'm at." And in the adrenaline in the moment, he takes off running, and then you have an officer shoot him. So now we're also, and this is where people get me wrong, is that often it comes off as anti-police that I'm talking about. And sure, like I'm against the idea of policing, but at the same time, we're traumatizing people. It's not a healthy thing for a police officer to shoot and kill somebody. That person also has a life. That person has a family. Now that person is traumatized as well. At the end of the day, what are we as a society getting out of these processes? But yet, Jamal, they continue to seem to happen regardless of actually helping anyone.
Yeah, I mean, so a few points. If you were a cop, you would have did the same thing. Now, I say that because...
Done what?
you would have gotten out the car, you would have chased that guy, you would have gotten out the car, ran at top speed with gun in hand.
But not if you're following police protocols. This is rare. Like, this is not what most police officers do in this situation. Here in Washington, D.C., we had a high-speed chase. Terrence Sterling was killed in the same way.
Yeah.
The police officer was let go of the force because you're not supposed to engage in high-speed chases like that, especially in a situation in Terrence Sterling. He was on a motorbike. So I don't think most officers would do it.
Okay,
but
most
there
might
are
be too strong. Let's let most. Okay, let's take away most. I guess my point is, the moment that you get into this kind of hero mindset of, I'm going to get this guy, and this guy's defying my authority, it becomes much more likely, just mindset-wise, from the position of authority that society gives you and for your job gives you and the way that you see yourself, to engage in something like that, basically chasing that person to try to catch him. Also, there's the other thing that the moment that the person is driving that way, the cop can make the assertion or make the assumption, okay, he's doing that for a reason in order to get away for a reason, which is why I started off saying, don't do that. Like, this is screwed up on so many accounts. Because, for one, we teach cops in a very particular way of your authority matters more than anything else, including the life of the other individual. Even if that person is supposed to be selling cigarettes, you could choke that person to death and get away with it. Like, that's the way we allow our cops to behave and operate. So let's put that in right there. Then you add in the secondary factor of somebody running in a car, recklessly driving. And to be honest, we don't entirely know the entirety of the story. But the catch is, he is on Facebook live stream. So at the very least, know he was flipping out behind the wheel of a car in a way that he wasn't supposed to be flipping out behind the wheel of a car and could have injured or killed somebody. So let's recognize both of these things are taking place at the exact same time. At the end of the day, though, after everything is said and done, do you have to kill him? Like, it's that feeling of, like, even if that guy did everything wrong, let's say everything in that process, that guy was entirely wrong, meaning the driver, the way he behaved, how he was behaving, all that stuff. At the end of the process, does it have to end up dead? And that's where, that's what's like, oh, God, why does he have to end up dead? And feel for his sister, even though it's a horrible statement, couldn't you just beat him up? Beating them up is, a little different. And in London, they have tactics where they try to get people without necessarily trying to murder the person.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I hear what you're saying, but I see it slightly differently because the person in my situation, in my opinion, I guess I don't know enough about this and we'll find out more, was in some state of mental health despair. I don't think this person had like a great family, a wife, and was just like chilling without issue. And then one day they just were like, you know what, I'm kind of bored. I'm going to go for a high speed chase. Like something there was factors that led up to this moment. And our society. But my point is, our point is then society has then somehow come across and said, we're not going to intervene at any of those lead up points. And this happens with so many different incidences. That they basically say, we're not going to intervene at any of these moments before this high-speed chase. The first time we're going to intervene as a society is a police officer with immunity to kill with a weapon and a vehicle. That's the first time we're going to engage in this person's life. So the larger fix for me is like, how do you even pull back and prevent this stuff? And as a society, we've simply said, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to let police handle it. And at the end of the day, police handling it leads to a 25-year-old killed and a police officer traumatized or in a situation where they're going to be back on the streets and having killed once. Often these police officers are second and third time offenders.
Well, I guess I'm making the point that in this case, the cop was basically doing his job. Like, there's no way for that cop to know. I mean, well, killing part, take that part out. But there's no way for the cop to know that that person is having a mental breakdown, that person is driving recklessly. Like, these are things that it is impossible for that cop to know. And just because he's on Facebook losing and flipping out, he could be flipping out just because he realized, oh, God, I've just screwed up. Like, I don't know his mental condition. There's no way for the cop to know his mental condition. The cop sees somebody who's recklessly driving that can kill somebody. So usually I am, against the cops when I'm talking about stuff like this. I am not for the killing at all. But I agree with you that the moment that you get to an endpoint in regards to a bad consequence, there's no good option. Meaning there is no good outcome for the situation at that point because society at that point has allowed it to devolve into this point where you have a cop engaging in this. I agree with you on that. Yeah, I agree with you.
And then you ask yourself, like, how much is it a police issue? I mean, I was here in D.C. I think I told the story on the show where I was talking to a handful of police officers and they were upset because the person they had pulled over, I was just asking if that person was okay and if there was anybody I needed to call. And they said, well, who are you going to call for us? Aren't you concerned about us? And it was like, it's not really between us and it's not between the police officers. It's the elected officials who set the policy. The mayor of Washington, D.C. oversees the police. The president oversees the U.S. war machine, right? And so it's these politicians that get into office that I think we need to put a lot of that blame towards. Because, again, we're asking officers, ground patrol people to become basically first-line healthcare providers with
That's
guns. Right. None of it makes any sense, and they're being asked to do stuff that I surely wouldn't ask them to do, and they should ask again before a politician sends them back into these situations. Jamar, with that, we do need to leave it here for the hour, but after the break, we have another hour of political misfits. I'm excited. Ajamu Baraka, the former Green Party nominee for vice president and the national organizer of Black Alliance for Peace, is with us after the break. You're listening to Political Misfits live on Radio Sputnik here in Washington, D.C. We're back after this.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlakeber here, kind of, sort of, with Jamar Thomas. We're not together, but we're lucky to be brought to you remotely from our homes while our engineers continue to plug away there. Big shout out to Andre, Saul, Ryan, and Dimitri for keeping us live here on the air. We're here for the next hour. Stay tuned after that. When we go off air, By Any Means Necessary comes on after us, followed by Loud and Clear and The Critical Hour. Some great programming here on Radio Sputnik. You can give us and those other shows a call. Give us a call, 202-521-1320. Lots to cover over the next hour, including a look at what international movements are popping up in response to the global pandemic we are facing, how Black culture is used to attract affluent whites back to the center of cities, and whether or not the United States Postal Service can survive the Trump administration. We are now joined by Ajamu Baraka, the national organizer of Black Alliance for Peace, and notably for the second part of our conversation, he was also the former Green Party nominee for Vice President of the United States in 2016. Ajamu Baraka, welcome to the show.
It's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Pleasure is all ours. Ajamu, I'm extremely excited to have you on the show. You are someone I often look to see where I should put my energy and where to point the direction of my work. So it is a true honor to talk to you. Ajamu, new job numbers are out showing another 3 million plus people have now filed for unemployment, while the Trump administration and governors look to accelerate the reopening of their own economies. Instead of neoliberalism and corporate capitalism admitting that they were no match for a global pandemic and admit their losses, they are now demanding those they oppress to march to their own death. It is grim, it is brutal, and it is inhumane. Ajamu, I'm curious, how do we fight back against this death march, and what is the counter reaction and movement that can rise and match this intense force?
That is a very important question. We are seeing that there are attempts to resist. As the listeners probably know, there was a national strike that was called for May 1st. A number of organizations, including worker centers, et cetera, came together to try to organize a response to say to those so-called essential workers who were already working that there was going to be a social force standing with them to demand that they at least have something as simple as personal protective equipment. But also it was a movement that said that we should resist being driven back to work in conditions that could still be unsafe, and that we should not agree to a policy at the base of it was a decision that said either we provide sufficient resources to allow people to stay home who didn't have to work, we engaged in mitigation and had a a process of so-called opening back up the economy that would be safe. Or we say, above that, we're going to take the additional deaths and drive people back into the workplace. And that's exactly what has happened. And so there are efforts to try to just, that the only way we're going to be effective in trying to counteract that is to strengthen our organizational capacity. We need to take advantage of the fact that there is a new kind of radicalization taking place. People are beginning to really see and understand the role that they play in this economy and the contrary interests that is responsible for driving them back into environments in which their various lives are threatened. So it goes back to a very simple proposition. How do we build an effective working class-based, if you will, resistance against the interests of capital?
So can I ask you, Ajamu Baraka, how do we build that movement? I mean, there's obviously been success over the last few years. We've seen successful teacher strikes. We've obviously are seeing more and more different labor movements take hold here. A lot of wildcat strikes, which is really impressive because people are just doing it on their own. But at the same time, let's be realistic. In many ways, the union movement, the labor movement in the United States has been defanged both externally and the attacks on it, but also internally. There are a lot of unions who are basing their endorsements at local political levels based on who they can get contracts with, but may not share the same political ideology. How do you see the reformation and the retooling of a concerted effort around a labor movement in the United States?
Well, part of what's happening in the country is that there are various kinds of motions in place to deal with the fact that unions have, in fact, been in the pockets of most Democrats. They're not prepared to engage in real oppositional politics. There's been some discussion around developing a new labor party. You have the ongoing conversations around building other kinds of party formations. So what has to happen is that we have to try to take advantage of this new energy, if you will. Still relatively disorganized, that they have various wildcat strikes. Bring those various elements together. Now, one essential that I think might be beneficial to this movement coming out of the strike effort. The effort is May 1st. Now those forces are saying that should have a strike every first of the month until there's a recognition of the various demands that are being forwarded. Then that's going to help to galvanize these disparate forces. Remains to be seen. There's no formula right now. We're basically in uncharted waters, uncharted territory. Basically, things are moving so rapidly. No formula in terms of how we need to move, except we've got to try to experiment and bring together all of these various disparate forces, building new kinds of concentrations to see if we can find a common basis for unity and a common emotion, build a new kind of social bloc in the U.S. How that's going to happen and our success remains to be seen, but we have to try to figure this thing out. I don't have the answer to this.
I mean, I'm curious, Ajamu, if I was trying to kind of think about the pacing of movements, how movements get built and some of the time frames to them. And for me, I think one historical lens to look at, and I think history is a little too close to use this lens in some ways, but in 2008, you have the financial crisis and the Great Recession that they're calling it in the United States, a mortgage crisis, a fraud and corruption crisis, whatever you want to talk about it. And that's 2008. And then in September of 2011, nearly 3 years later, you have the kickoff of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And so I was curious if you think the same type of time is needed to let the current economic situation kind of sink in, see what the response is. And then is it another 2 years before an economic movement like Occupy kicks off, or are we at a whole different historical moment and at a much different accelerated pace?
I think we're at a different historical moment. I think that the pace is very, very rapid. Whatever unfolds in the next couple of months, will have a profound impact on politics going forward. So, I think that the Occupy experience was a very interesting one, but I think we learned a lot from that. I see the political consciousness today in a different place. I think that we have some stronger formations, even though we're still relatively weak in terms of our institutions. I think that because of the growing sort of general consciousness among so many people today, that there's not going to be a recovery, and people may be more open. That is, people beyond just social activists may be more open to looking at different alternatives to what we have in place today. And that's reflected, too, for example, in some of the potential that we have with that Bernie Sanders campaign. Even though there were many, many contradictions, we still see that there were numbers of people in the U.S. who were recognizing that the status quo just was not working. They were willing to look at different alternatives and to experiment with different politics. So we got to figure out how to galvanize that kind of energy once again. But we're in completely different territory today.
Ajamu, I've gotten to the point, especially after 2020 and 2016, to believe that basically anything to get done politically is done through leverage, not necessarily done through begging. And that leverage is done in multiple ways. I mean, basically, the public needs to extricate itself from the political process and work, I would argue, in mass, under this notion of policy, not under ideas of policy. And the reason I say that, imagination is that much more emboldened when you don't necessarily have to be tethered to the auspices of, I need to get along within this kind of party structure. For example, the attacks on the post office, those postal workers should strike. The leverage in and of itself is bought by immediately striking, since what is taking place is an outright destruction of the postal service. I'll give you another one. When Donald Trump went on this notion that I'm going to build a wall, and I'm going to have all of these workers not having a paycheck in order to build this useless wall. Those airline workers were working there for months on end without getting paid, and at no point did they say, I am not going to do this. Like, how do we foster that level of class consciousness in the country to realize that you are being exploited, even when it's to the point where they're working and not getting paid for a president that is putting on theatrics and cares so little about them having a living? He cares more about the theatrics. How do those people get into the mindset that they don't care about you and that any salvation that you're going to have in regards to your society is going to be entirely through your own collective action with other people like you?
Isn't that kind of understanding really beginning to be developed among people who are seeing the kinds of policies being enacted by the rulers, driving them back to work? There's consciousness is something that has to be built. There's no formula for it, if you will, besides direct engagement with, as you organize, and the changing objective conditions. So it seems to me, maybe be wrong, but it seems to me that for that kind of radicalization is now in place, to the extent that people are beginning to see that the only way they're going to be able to address their needs individually and collectively is recognizing they have different interests, that they, in fact, have the power to address those things they have if they operate collectively.
Yes.
We're beginning to understand that even this whole concept of the so-called essential workers, if certain workers are essential, then the question becomes, why do you need bosses? Those kind of questions are being raised by people. So beginning to understand that the whole class structure and the whole ownership structure is something that now can be looked at more critically. And that's how radical consciousness is built.
Yeah, no, it's a remarkable moment. And we talked, obviously, the first few weeks, Jamal, about the long-term changes that will come from COVID-19. In many ways, as we wade deeper into the pandemic, we kind of forget that a lot of changes like Ajamu's referencing there, like, why are bosses so essential? Why are policing petty crime so essential? They're not doing that right now because they themselves are afraid of the pandemic, but yet somehow society is still standing. So were all those petty stops warranted? I think there's going to be a lot of questions coming out like that. We do have a caller on the line. Maggie is here. Maggie, I believe you wanted to talk about this high-speed chase there. Ajamu, I don't know if you had the chance to see this horrific video and police killing there in Indianapolis of Sean Reed, but let's get Maggie's comments and then get your response. Maggie, are you here with us?
Yeah, I am. I'm so glad you brought up the idea of culture, because that's what I wanted to bring up. You know, we have municipalities that have gone bankrupt, after 2008 or lost money, and we don't look at whatever the culture is of the police force, and we're doing a post-mortem on Bernie Sanders, but on these more local levels, are we doing any post-mortem on exactly what happened? Because I've seen. I grew up in Indianapolis. But I don't have a lot of insight because I haven't lived there for a long time. But we don't look at guy if he was part of the police force. Policemen used to. Officers used to have that, they would have a partner in their car. Guys working alone. And don't have a partner if you don't have somebody else to help you with decision making. You're just out there loose. You're in danger. There's going to be more fear. There's no, or we don't know if this guy's, rogue person, or maybe that the whole culture of that police force is. I don't know any of these things, and nobody looks at them.
Yeah. No, Maggie, thank you so much for your call. Ajamu makes me think of a case in my hometown of Rockville, Illinois, maybe a year and a half ago or so. A really bizarre incident, 4 a.m. Somehow a black man gets pulled over by a rookie police officer in his first year, and they both end up shooting one another. But there's no clear sign of who initiated it and what took place. And instantly the next day you had the black victim basically be casted as this nefarious character, everything questioned about him. And within a few days, you had a full military salute-esque type of funeral for this young police officer, basically being called a hero. And there was absolutely no definitive evidence on either side that could tell anyone what exactly happened. But the culture of American imperialism, of whiteness, of the security and the police force, it's deeply embedded within this country. And I think we often get distracted by just Donald Trump and don't, as Maggie said, really boil down to hyper local neighborhood level analyses.
Exactly. And even though I'm not familiar with the specifics of the situation in Indianapolis, it sounds very familiar. So I wouldn't be surprised that we've seen over and over again. And even your example there in Rockdale. And these kinds of incidents will continue as long as we don't have communities that have the ability to control policing in their own community. And that's why many of us are suggesting that, we're demanding that these forces that we consider to be occupation forces are in fact drawn from our communities. We have the ability to police ourselves, if you will. And because of our colonized status, we believe that these forces are, in fact, oppressive forces, and that they should, in fact, be withdrawn. And concerned about, we raise those issues of this consequences of this pandemic and the collapse of the economy. We are seeing more and more that the state is more than willing to engage in violence and violent repression against working class communities. And so we see ourselves in a war, but a one-sided war at this point. Therefore, we need to be preparing for ourselves. We are making demands for a real autonomy and self-determination in our communities. And this is what needs to be done. You raised the question about movement. And one thing we have to understand is that we're not going to be able to build a strong and unified sort of left opposition to this country until we recognize the particular kinds of experiences that various people have. Be willing to recognize those and respect that to build unity on the basis of those differences also. To understand that there's going to be movements, not one movement, as we build an effective opposition here in the U.S.
Ajamu, I'm curious, is there, Bob, and sometimes the team at Sputnik, we have these conversations with Jackie, Sean, and myself on this notion of class versus race in regards to political or policy. And I tend to lean on the side of class, even though I know they're intrinsically linked, more so because I can't necessarily doing anything about stopping somebody from being racist other than making their material conditions better, which will lessen the opportunity or at the very least incentive for them to be racist. But I do acknowledge that there's a racial element to this, whether it's doctors not giving enough medication, whether it's the implicit bias in dealing with cops, or in this situation, where somebody may get shot or killed and there's a higher propensity of that person being of a particular color. Are there policy prescriptions for those type of items? Like, my class analysis of it looks at this notion of, okay, let's deal with the material benefits of the population, and you can bring people over even if they don't like you because they would be interested in their class. But am I missing something on the racial element of this, that there are policies that may be able to try to ameliorate that I just don't see how it necessarily works?
I think that you are correct. I don't see any policy mitigations. I think that we can put in place certain kinds of procedures where there's a more aggressive response in terms of prosecutions from the national level, but even then there's no guarantees. Yeah. There's enough rules that are in place for interventions, for example, from the national level. Yeah. It's not being utilized. You look at, for example, during the 8 years of the Obama administration, only saw fit to prosecute one of these killer cops in 8 years. So, no, I think that we have to understand is that there's a racial component, but that class component is as strong, if not sometimes stronger, because in our communities, the number of the cops are engaged in these incidents, and just many of them are black. You look at what's happening in places like Baltimore and Chicago. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. We have more issues with the black cops than some of those white cops. So there's the role of the police, nature of the state, and that interconnection between race and class in terms of propping up and defending objective interests of capital.
I'm curious then, because that seems like it opens up the conversation around international movements, this shared oppression, global capitalism run amok. I'm curious if we look beyond the borders, Ajamu, of how it goes about to organize an international solidarity movement, and is it imperative to have an international movement if you're going to take on U.S. capitalism and corporate capture of our system?
It's absolutely imperative. Imperative because we have certain responsibilities in citizens and residents of empire. We engage the state. It's imperative because it's quite clear that this state has decided that the shell of liberal democracy has to be jettisoned. It is now an impediment, and that is going to engage in activities that really define the state as a rogue state. And the consequence of these rogue actions are quite devastating to people around the world. So reciprocal solidarity requires a kind of internationalist perspective, recognizing that it's a global system that we are up against, and that global solidarity, coordinated activities, the concentration of power among the oppressed, colonized is absolutely necessary. And so, yes, if we don't have internationalism, then we're going to fall prey to the kind of nationalist appeals we see emanating from forces, for example, groups around the Trump forces. We say in the Black Alliance of Peace, for example, the issue of war and militarism, these are class issues. And so we say not one drop of blood from the working class, the poor, defend the interests of the capitalist oligarchy. We're not going to allow our young sons and daughters to be used as cannon fodder fighting against the working classes of other nations. Yeah, that kind of consciousness is absolutely necessary at this moment in history.
Yeah. And Jamal, you're somebody that's seen it. We've both been very privileged and lucky to be able to travel a lot of this world and meet a lot of different people in different cultures and live in different spaces. And I got to tell you, Jamal, there's a lot of people that I met in a lot of different countries that more align with my value set than a lot of Americans do. And it's based on how Americans consume, how they spend, how they vote politically. But yet the system tells me that at all costs, I should bleed blood for my fellow compatriots here in the United States, regardless of what our values say or how we live our lives. It seems pretty obvious that if you're going to have a liberated movement around the world that comes to a better structure or setup, it would have to be internationalism, basically just because that's how humans are. They want to connect across culture, but yet we've been so narrowly defined in these geographic spaces.
So I think it's important to. So I think two things, and I know it's going to sound contradictory, but I think it's true. From the standpoint of trying to get some kind of international movement and pushing back against a capitalistic system or political system that's been ossified in regards to the way it behaves, particularly in regards to the context to the audience or to the public's ability to get changes for it to behave rationally. I think it's fair to say that thinking internationally is yes. By the same token, I think the things that need to be done need to take place here. Like, so say for the moment you have an uprising in a particular country that is socialist, democratic, it can be squashed. And I think we've seen in the governments of South America that those governments were squashed by the United States effectively putting pressure on those governments. Same thing in regards to other parts around the world, where the U.S. we use as financial leverage or military leverage to crush it. I think I would make the argument that any changes that need to take place, if you're going to do anything for global capitalism, it has to be done in the United States. Otherwise, you're going to have this kind of base of power that can basically club the other nations into submission. Whereas if you can take control of the U.S. to some degree or have some leverage over the system, then you can mitigate that and allow those movements internationally to flourish. Ajamu, am I wrong on that? Or am I being too Pollyannish or too cynical in my assessment on that?
I understand. I understand that position and a certain logic to it. I would then raise the question: what do we do about the latte left U.S. is not prepared to engage in any real active oppositional politics? That one of the reasons why we have situations where the U.S. is able to effectively intervene in these various countries because of the weakness of the left, the U.S. And the fact that instead of left forces taking absolute anti-imperialist positions, they want to instead critique and analyze the particular state that finds itself in the crosshairs of U.S. imperialism to determine whether or not that state should be supported by the left, the U.S., and in Western Europe. Objectively puts them on the same side as imperialism. So the issue we have, or the challenge I think that we have, is how do we at the center of empire really effectively engage the state, and how and under what circumstances do we make sure that we try to ensure that any interventions into other parts of the world, other nations, is effectively defeated in the U.S. So I think that the revolutionary momentum, the revolutionary initiative is really, in fact, going to come from the global South. And we've got to figure out in the North what kind of role that we play. I just don't think that the human material in the U.S. And Western Europe is there to be the leading force for global revolutionary change.
John, we just have a minute left, so I'm going to ask a question that would take much more than a minute to answer. But I'm always curious what happened to the peace movement here in the United States. I do think to some degrees there is an anti-war movement still to be had. We've seen it out in the streets against the Iraq invasion. But for me, there also is a positive aspect to peace and to peace building that I don't see within the political parties. I'm curious how we recreate that space and where we look to re-galvanize the America's consciousness towards those international wars.
That effort is taking place. It's not taking place inside the parties, but it's taking place. We're moving beyond just peace, moving to anti-imperialism. That is the absolute necessity right now. There is motion. That's why we are building the Black Alliance of Peace. We are interfacing with the National Anti-War Coalition, all of the other coalitions, anti-war coalitions, anti-imperialist coalitions in the U.S. under the radar because, of course, we're not getting a lot of coverage from the bourgeois press. But issues are such that basically we have to galvanize our forces. That, in fact, is taking place. We have to, in fact, build a more powerful anti-war movement in this country, and that's taking place.
Yeah, powerful stuff, Ajamu. Thank you for reminding us of that. With that, we are out of time. That was Ajamu Baraka, the national organizer for Black Alliance for Peace. Ajamu, you have quite a bit of work throughout the internet. Where can people go to find more of your publications?
First, go to the blackallianceforpeace.com to see our organizational work. That's the main thing. You can go to ajamubaraka.com to see some of my personal writings. Main thing now, getting organized. So go to blackallianceforpeace.com.
Organize, organize, organize. Fantastic. Thank you again, Ajamu Baraka. After the break, our weekly Trends with Benefits segment this week, we look at how blackness is commodified to sell luxury condominiums and high-end retail space across the United States. You are listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in D.C. We're back after this.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Look, up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's
a Tic Tac UFO, man. Just like the one the U.S. Navy caught on video in 2004, but only came clean about it last year.
No, I'm pretty sure it was a bird.
Whatever.
Get nerdy on Wednesdays with Revelations. The Political Misfits look into the world's mysteries and a lot of UFO stuff.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. Time for our weekly Trends with Benefits segment. This week's featured trend takes a deeper look at the ways in which whites are being sold space in historically black communities throughout the country, specifically how black culture has been used as a marketing tool to attract wealthy whites to Chocolate City, Washington, D.C. To talk about these very disturbing Made in America trends is Brandy Thompson Summers, an assistant professor of geography at the University of California, Berkeley, and author of the book Black in Place, The Spatial Aesthetics of Race in a Post-Chocolate City. Brandy, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, it's an honor to have you. I did have a chance to read an excerpt of the book, and I greatly look forward to reading the full piece in the near future. I really appreciated the voice you centered in the work and the focus you gave to culture and history. So much of the story of gentrification for many is lost in the very shallow conversations around economics. The whole, don't you want nice things in poor neighborhoods? What's wrong with more wealth in deteriorating places? What you get to in your work, and that I hope we see more folks begin to do, is tell the personal and cultural narratives to gentrification, both so folks understand the violence and destruction caused by the trend, and in this positive place where people can fully appreciate the work of those working to fight to preserve culture and to continue to hold space against those forces. Brandy, if I can ask you first to dive a little bit more into the overview of Black in Place and why you chose Washington, D.C. as a case study, and then we can get into some of the specifics.
Sure. So I think it's great that you're recognizing the importance of this both personal and cultural narrative of gentrification, because too often we assume that it's this economic process that knows no race, color, creed, gender, sexuality, and that's just not true. And so what I really wanted to focus on in Black in Place are the ways that Blackness, or this long history that the United States has had, this relationship that the country has had with Blackness, to understand our movements through these different economic periods and historic periods. So I chose DC in a lot of ways by accident. I had moved to the area in 2011, and I had planned to do some work on a Black political organization, but came to the area of the H Street Northeast corridor and started to notice that it was just a really strange place. And by strange, I mean I had read a little bit about it, but what I was reading didn't necessarily match my experience. And so I had already done work thinking about the role of aesthetics and the role of Blackness and understanding kind of how we see politics, how we value different bodies and different spaces. But to look at a place like H Street, especially in DC, really made me think about like what attachments we have to certain ideas of race, or again, the fundamental aspects of how we understand different people in a changing city. It made a lot of sense to kind of think about DC also because we had already been in the first term of President Obama's presidency, and we had already seen the ways that this kind of race-neutral, post-race discourse was taking over, even in places like DC where the numbers of Black people were dwindling. And so I thought it would be really important to not only look at the history and what contributed to this shift, but also the ways that the Blackness that was such an idea of pride and cultural history had morphed into something that was used to attract different people, to attract more wealthier, whiter individuals, to purchase more expensive homes, to invite, like you mentioned in the outset, luxury boutique, not only restaurants, but also stores, and really kind of commodify this idea of Blackness in a way that didn't focus on the actual Black people who were experiencing the violence of displacement. And so really kind of unfolded that way. I was able to focus again, not so much on the needs of or the desires of gentrifiers, but really focus on the impact of what it's doing to the actual space itself.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that because it's a fascinating street, H Street Northeast. I lived there for a year in 2014, and I could feel all the things you were saying. It's hard to describe to somebody who hasn't been there. It's just a mess of a street, basically, where you had a historically Black community had been gutted out in many ways because of the uprisings in the 1960s, a lot of retail, a lot of history to the space. And then you just all of a sudden had a wave of huge investments. The Whole Foods took over the Murphy's grocery store, tons of luxury condos, stuff that nobody could afford. And I always remember one story where myself and a partner at the time were looking at potentially creating a co-working space, artist loft kind of setup. And we wanted to talk to neighborhood residents about what they would want. And Brandy, it was wild because on one end you had people that were living in stable housing or were spending a lot of their time outside on the streets next to incredibly wealthy, fancy homes. And you go and talk to the people about the rent of that space to rent it there on H Street. And it was like $25,000 a month. And so to be able to afford something like that, you would have to have a high-end wine bar, high-end restaurant to potentially even make that much money. And so basically longtime residents that are standing out there on the street looking for something to engage with or take place in the space in which they've occupied for decades, being priced out of their communities. And these buildings otherwise just stay empty until somebody does have that money. So these people that own it were basically sitting on the property, and they said it was an investment for their children. They were in no hurry to sell it. And so you had these affluent white people that didn't even live in the city that owned a building that would one day go to their children as their investment fund, while people that were basically stuck without homes or without an economy that they could engage in, basically staring at empty buildings.
That's right. And that's really important to focus on because on the one hand, there's an emphasis in thinking about gentrification that's primarily around residential issues, right? But there's a commercial aspect that matters so much, and it still has material implications. So if we think about conditions and how small Black businesses end up on the losing end when there are downward spirals in the economy, or even when there are upticks in the economy, it's still Black-owned businesses that don't overcome a lot of the issues that might have happened in a previous era. And so on top of that, in terms of consumption and thinking about consumers, like you mentioned, those longtime working class Black folks who had relied on certain amenities, whether it be state-sponsored amenities or, again, just basic needs, a local drugstore, and I mentioned a bit in the book, barbershops and beauty shops. Those types of service-oriented businesses aren't there as much anymore. And so you're finding that there's this different retail climate that doesn't necessarily welcome you. Like a stranger in your own neighborhood, it increasingly becomes so. And it's not based on revenue that's generated. It's based on this aesthetic. And that's
let me interrupt you there. Let me interrupt you there because I think that idea of not being welcome to spaces is kind of the core of a lot of your book, and talking about how Blackness is marketed to whites to attract them to spaces. And so you have Black culture, you have cafes in DC that are playing Black people, whatever you want to define that as. But for my point, basically music that would speak to Black culture, but then all of their patrons are white.
Mm-hmm. And that's part that, I mean, we've seen, reports in Brooklyn, various areas. Definitely, I'm in the Bay Area right now. That's certainly the case in the San Francisco Bay Area. But it's this way that there's an attachment to Black culture, or what's been really marginalized as Black culture, or understanding the concept of urban as being Black. But part of that, the danger of it, or at least the concept of it being dangerous or gritty, but still exciting and interesting, is what draws people to that particular space. In addition to this liberal idea of, I'm going to come in and I'm going to contribute to this space and respect its history. And so that's when you see, cultural tourism grow, or you see these ways that the culture is consumed as this artifact of history that someone wants to be able to say that they are also a part of, or that they respect. And it becomes an issue because, again, no one's addressing the displacement, dispossession of the Black people who have been living there for years.
Brandy, speaking of the piggyback on something that Bob said, where, you have the artist and everyone there is white. James Brown's I'm Black and I'm Proud. I don't know if people know this. The video, everybody in the audience is white. When he's doing I'm Black and I'm Proud, it is the weirdest sight ever to watch, but nevertheless, there it was. I was in Israel. I think this goes back to 2008. It was before Obama was elected. Hillary Clinton had made the comment that the United States will commit the U.S. military to Israel regardless of what takes place. Now, if you're in Israel, this ends up with certain conversations with people. As if you're an American, it always just comes up. So I'm walking back to my hotel one day. I end up stopping at one of the booths. The gentleman who's there realizes that I'm American, Black American, and he gets excited and he says, "We love ends here." He says, I love you guys. Now, he's saying this in broken English, saying it horribly, and doesn't quite understand the significance of using the N-word in regarding to somebody who's an African American. He was genuinely excited. Now, the wild part is, the reason why he was okay with it is because he had watched so much rap music and so many movies that basically he thought this is just how communication with Black folks are. Now, after that, I realized, I was like, yeah, maybe we went wrong somewhere along the way for this stuff, in the way that it's not even real culture. It's almost like theatrical culture, put into movies and packaged as if this was indicative of this is who these people are. And you have people who make a lot of product and money off of that, when the rest of the community, not so much. But that is a commodification of a culture, that's a commodification of sexuality, that's a commodification of hypermasculinity, in this kind of showy way that makes people, that people don't necessarily have the reality of it, even if they get stuck with this kind of image of it. Does that make sense? It's a weird scenario. And by the way, we have a caller. Let's go to Daniel, who's on the line. Daniel, how's it going? Okay, Daniel might not be still there. So, Brandy, we're going to go back to you.
Daniel.
Oh, is he there? Daniel?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, there you are. What's going on, Daniel?
So, I wanted to ask your guest, why haven't people like her focused on policies that would probably fix these problems, such as a vacancy tax, such as a land value tax? Because I live in San Antonio, Texas. One of the biggest problems is that people are getting taxed out of their homes. And because they're getting taxed out of their homes, because the property value is so high, ridiculously high, when you should be just paying taxes on the value of the land and not what sits on the land. These get strong towns, so she wants to go look for them. But why don't people focus on policies? Because we're not going to get public housing.
Cool. Daniel, thank you for the call. I assume the doctor is working on those things, that you could tell us a little bit more about the policies that would help support efforts to push back on some of these trends of whiteness commodifying black spaces.
Yeah, so I think, what's important to note here, one, yes, I actually do look at policy in the book. And so while it's really policy that deals with how to, yes, the land value is out of control. And considering where I live right now, this is a perfect ways that the wild speculation in terms of land value. But that's actually not going to solve all the problems. And I don't think policy is going to solve all the problems, because there has to be at least a recognition of how displacement and dispossession takes place. But it's not something that if you change a policy to limit costs, that's going to automatically leave it open for everyone. And so I identify ways that seemingly race-neutral, and I call something like that a seemingly race-neutral policy, isn't going to fix the problem. You have to recognize ways in which power does still flow through the government in terms of understanding who gets access to things and who doesn't. I talk about ways that neoliberalism has shifted the relationship of the state itself into promoting more privatized elements and services that used to be public. And so it's not just about affordability necessarily. It's not about having public housing. It's about having affordable housing for sure. But in addition to that, it's supporting economies and different cultural industries that don't necessarily commodify the actual people who are supposed to be shopping and again, consuming. But I also want to speak to, this idea that there's a way in which the world is consuming Black culture. A lot of that still has to do with the same things. It has to do with who has power over the culture industries. It's not Black people who are necessarily distributing or really profiting off of these particular types of representations that are being consumed, let's say, in Israel, right? It's ways that there are multiple economic elements that are working together in addition to the cultural elements that package Blackness as being a certain way. And what I thought was really important for me to show is that there's a way to understand and to really think more analytically about what everyday Blackness is. Just being a regular Black person, how that should have significance in how we understand housing policy, commercial policy, understand the ways that representation and kind of material aspects have an impact on our society. So I think these exceptional representations end up being what's the problem. And that's what I document in the book. All of these examples of art, like I focus more on visual art, but we can even think about the sonic art. Think about ways that sound carries a certain idea of race and how that might automatically create stereotypes that aren't necessarily produced and marketed by the actual people who are producing it.
Yeah, I love what you did in the book, as well as just looking at the vernacular and how powerful language is, and even to hear our caller look at a lot of language that's rooted within the current broken systems that we have. And so when we talk about public housing, it means one thing within the context of the United States, but it's been completely bastardized from what public housing could be. There is no conversation around what social housing could be, but yet we work within these narrow framework of capitalism that aren't going to meet the needs of the people. And at the same time, then you have that language that basically keeps us boxed within a specific kind of framework and ideology and imagination. And I thought two words that you looked at in your book were the words diverse and progressive. And there are two words that progressive has always irked me. I bought the URL in 2014 is what is progress? Because everybody in Washington, D.C., from the developers to the gentrifiers to the longtime people that have been trying to displace people, as well as the good liberal-minded folks, were all calling themselves progressives. Joe Biden apparently is the most progressive president of all time. There is no meaning to that word. And then this other term of diverse. I live in Ward 1, Columbia Heights of Washington, D.C., which is the most diverse neighborhood in all of Washington, D.C., and our elected officials constantly tout that. But then when you actually look behind these words, diverse and progressive, Brandon, they seem to fall apart and not carry much weight.
Right, that's absolutely right. And actually we're profiting off of that idea, right? And so diverse becomes like this signifier, this empty signifier that can just float onto whoever and whatever space we have. And right, I think Columbia Heights is a perfect example. I mean, if we think about the transition of Columbia Heights over the last 15 to 20 years, we're seeing ways that there is this Latinx culture that has been commodified in similar ways, but it's more so focusing on food or music, or not necessarily making sure that the people who have been living there and have built the community are actually able to stay. And it's become a trendy place. And so it's like diversity has no teeth. It doesn't actually do anything for the people who are most marginalized. If anything, it becomes, again, I focus on really diversity being the aestheticized idea. It's not based in any kind of material reality. It just makes us feel good to say that something's diverse. And in the case of what I call a post-chocolate city, all it does is make Blackness just one of the strings in this particular tapestry, one of the pieces of fabric, right? And so it doesn't actually lend any credence to a particular Black history or the concept of a Black city. Instead, it makes it a mean place for all, even when it's not.
We have a caller on the line, the one and only DJ One Love. What's happening, Jamal?
Hey, Bob, how you doing? And Brandy for being on. I love what.
Thanks, man. It's nice to hear your voice. Appreciate you calling in. We'll have to have you as a guest in the future to hear from you. What's on your mind today with what you're hearing?
I just wanted to respond and actually kind of just back up what Brandy was saying, in particular about the cultural part. You know, I'm not a native Washingtonian. I moved to the D.C. area back in the early 90s, the mid-90s, from Pittsburgh, PA. And just from a Black man's perspective of understanding the impact of gentrification, I moved from a city where the unemployment rate at that time, and still is, was around 50% for Black men. And I moved to the Washington, D.C. area because the unemployment rate was much lower. But it was also the historical and cultural opportunities that were provided in a D.C. area, which is very similar to like Brooklyn or Atlanta, in which Black men could get jobs and well-paid jobs, and you didn't have to have a master's or a PhD to get a well-paying job. Now, the thing is, when I moved down to D.C., it was like Wakanda. Like the best way I could describe it, because it's like, wow, you saw all these Black people in high appointed positions. You saw all types of Black businesses and you know, clubs that were like, you know, jazz clubs, and in particular, Bohemian Caverns, to give an example, one of the second oldest nightclub in the country. And since the gentrification situation has taken over, you've seen the majority of that stuff disappear. And the cultural and historical aspect of it is not being taken into context, that we're erasing American history, not just Black history, and replacing it with this cookie cutter format that Andy Shalal, owner of Us Boys and Poets, said, in which you see the same thing up and down these streets, and it's across the country. I've been out to the Bay Area, been down south, up in New York and everything. And the question that has come up when talking about fighting gentrification, and Bob, you know, I've been on the front lines of addressing these issues, is for a lot of white people, do they ever ask to the Black people that were previously here? You know, do they even care? Because it's almost the best way I can describe it is imagining back in being a Native American in the 1600s, and then here comes, you know, the Europeans, and next you know, the rest is history. Or it kind of feels similar to that in that, you know, everything is just taken over, and then it's almost as if, okay, well, we helped you, and you're better off now than you were previously.
Yeah, no, that's how it's framed. Yeah, thanks, Jamal, for the call. We greatly appreciate it. Dr. Brandy Thompson-Summers, we just have a minute left with you here. I'll give you the final word to respond there and to plug your book, Black in Place.
Sure. So thank you for calling, Jamal, and actually making some of those statements. It's really important. There is this disappearance that's happening, and it's really important to notice. there is a way that being dispossessed, being displaced, it does make us think back to understanding, removal of Native Americans from various places in the United States. And while it's not exactly the same, it's certainly something that we have to recognize. Again, it's the ways in which power determines what's valuable, who's valuable, what spaces can be inhabited, and which ones can't by whom. So I do really appreciate you, Bob and Jamal, for having me on the show. I would love for you to pick up my book, Black in Place, The Spatial Aesthetics of Race in a Post-Chocolate City. I think I really try to put some heart into it in terms of what I'm talking about. And I really love feedback. So please take a look at it. See if this is the gentrification that you're experiencing.
Yeah,
and again, not just in terms of the economic piece, but also this cultural element that's really important to understanding this true kind of contemporary moment in the U.S.
Yeah, powerful stuff. Thank you again. That was Dr. Brandy Thompson Summers. With that, we'll take one last quick break here on Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
The most important hour of the day. It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas, still here with my co-host, Bob Schleyhuber. I was trying to do too much at once in my head right there. So, Bob, where do you want to go? Ritual reading of the records, basically the race to the bottom in regards to the unemployment numbers? Do you want to go to a fight between Guns N' Roses and Steve Mnuchin? Do you want to go to the post office? And this one I find the most tragic. The right wing finally is a heartbeat away from their strategic objective, decades-long objective, of destroying the U.S. Postal Service to force people to only use private letter services, dramatically increasing the cost of letters and postal services.
Tell us what happened there, because there was a big move over there, right?
Yeah, there was a big move over there, and that's unfortunate. So Trump and the GOP donor has been appointed Postmaster General, which probably does not bode well for the U.S. Postal Service. The appointment was made by the United States Postal Board of Governors. Louis DeJoy, a businessman who ran the eerily named New Breed Corporation, that sounds gross, a private logistics and distribution company, has contributed at least $360,000 to the president's re-election campaign since January and another $70,000 to the Republican National Committee. Not bought at all. That's just this year, folks. DeJoy was most recently president of his own real estate investment and consulting company. The United States Postal Service warned that it might run out of money by this summer. It has been hamstrung by unusual restrictive rules governing how it funds employee health and retirement benefits, which suck up huge amounts of money. The president thinks it's simply too cheap and wants the service to jack up its prices, and Republicans have long warned to privatize the vital service. Now, that's the important part. They want it to jack up the prices so the other companies can jack up their prices, or that it would basically allow the other companies to be competitive with the Postal Service. That's all that's about. They're trying to destroy the Postal Service, and they put those onerous rules on it that none of the other companies have to deal with. This is a vital American service, and in the last polling, the public loves it, but the public doesn't realize what is taking place. That's the sad part, Bob. It's like we love the Postal Service, but they don't know enough about it to realize that it's under attack and has been under attack for the past few decades.
Yeah, until it's gone, will you realize how much you miss it? One other breaking news story. Apparently, Charlize Theron has sat down. Oh, sorry, no. Megyn Kelly. I get the two confused after that movie tomorrow. Megyn Kelly has sat down with Tara Reid, who is accusing former Vice President Joe Biden of sexually assaulting her for her first on-air camera interview since Biden denied the accusation. So we'll look forward to whatever that train wreck of an interview I'm sure that was. But the story's not going away. It's not going away, to say the least. Jamal, with that, we need to leave it there for today. A big shout out to all of our guests, Dr. Brandy Thompson Summers, Ajamu Baraka, and Alini Piva. Thank you, as always, to Ryan, Dimitri, Andre, and Saul, and the entire Sputnik News team for keeping us live on the radio. Shout out to our producer, Michelle Whitty. On behalf of Jamarl Thomas and myself, Bob Schlehuber, thank you for listening. Now get back to organizing.
Guys, I thank you all for showing up for the show. As always, I have to be honest, I'm a bit low energy today. I don't feel all that well. But we got through it together. So I'm going to say, we have super chats. Charles Cavan, why you block me from calling the show? Nobody's blocking you from calling the show, Charles. Maggie Smith, I would love it if you had Daddy Cherie on regularly. Daddy Cherie on is nice. I like her. Daddy Cherie, right. But Charles, nobody's blocking you from calling the show. So while we're remote, the engineers are basically doing multiple things. Typically, they're doing videos. Typically, they're dealing with volume and all this other stuff. And usually when we're at the studio, it's easier for people to call in because at that point, it's easier for them to communicate and they're doing less. Our producer and everyone else is there trying to help. So if you miss it, that's not because they're stopping you from calling the show. You're perfectly welcome to call the show. I promise you. They're not blocking you. Nobody's blocking you. I promise. All right, I'm going to leave this here. Like, share, subscribe, and thank you. Garden, don't feel better. It's my fault, Garden. It's my fault. I hope you get caught up on some sleep. Yeah, that too. I haven't slept yet. I just put on another shirt and just kind of did the news. No, this is my fault. I didn't sleep last night because I was working last night. And I was too sleepy this morning to go to clinic visit. And because I didn't go to the clinic visit, I feel like shit right now. It's fine. It's one of those things that you make the determination of what you have to negotiate with. Sometimes that's cash. Sometimes that's time. Sometimes that's just feeling shitty. Like, share, subscribe.